This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 130. Where do you draw the line on migration?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and this week, the desire to curb migration. Is migration good or bad for an economy? And if it needs to be controlled, just how do you do that? And would the world be a better or worse place if we all just stayed where we are? Oh, and Merry Christmas as well. It's the Debunking Economics Podcast. Well, migration is causing, and I suggest it's always caused, unrest in countries. Part of it is good old-fashioned xenophobia, because they're not like us, are they? Foreigners. And part of it is economic. In each case, the arguments tend to be heated and disproportionate. To a large extent, it prompted Brexit, which, of course, is pulling British society apart and, doing wonders for the democratic process, pulling that apart as well. But just as some countries want to cut migration, others say they need it. Canada, for example, wants to solve their ageing population problem and to fill the skills gap, and they reckon most of the new migrants they want will simply be filling vacant jobs. They're looking for about 1 million or so migrants per year. Their net migration at the moment is about 6 people per 1,000. In the UK, it's about 2.5. They want to get, they want more migrants. We want to get rid of migrants. So why this big difference in attitude, Steve?
There's a range of issues behind it. I mean, my feeling about migration was very strongly influenced by a wonderful article by a woman called Marie. I just remember her name. It's such a remarkable, beautiful name, Marie de la Provence. And she wrote an article in the 1973
She sounds foreign.
Pardon? Sounds forein, yeah.
I wouldn't trust that article. Yeah.
There you go. She's a Macquarie University academic back in Sydney, Australia. I don't know if she's around these days. But she analysed the attitudes of Australian migrants to new waves of migration, right from, pretty much the first wave of migration, which, of course, the locals didn't like. But that you could just shoot them back then, which they literally did. On landing, Captain Cook, I think at least 4 Aboriginals died on the day Captain Cook.
It's not tolerated. It's not tolerated anymore. We hasten to add.
Huh?
It's not tolerated anymore. We hasten to add for anybody who's not been to Australia.
It happened. So either 2 or 4 were shot by Cook's boarding party. But after you had the first wave of convicts in, and then the convicts being freed and so on, and then you started getting an actual migration program to move to Australia. She found that the course, the resistance, the attitude to migration varied with the trade cycle. So when there's a boom going on, nobody complained about migrants because there were tons of people already working, and you actually knew you needed extra labour around. So it went the opposite way to the trade cycle. During booms, there was very little upset. During slumps, there was a large amount of upset. And the trend was the group, have a guess which group was most resistant to new migration?
Well, I would have thought it'd be the low-skilled workers, because they'd be the ones, particularly in deprived parts of the country, where migrants would often go to those areas.
To some extent, but it's actually the previous wave of migrants were the greatest resistance to the next wave of migrants.
Yeah. But they were probably the low-skilled workers in those deprived areas of the country where the new migrants were arriving at as well.
Yeah. And so and therefore the people who felt most threatened were the ones in the jobs that the Australian residents didn't particularly want. Yeah. They filled them, and then bang, there's a slump coming on, and they've got more migrants saying, up, no thanks. So the xenophobia issue, which is still there. We generally think of xenophobia in terms of a dominant race I hate using the word race, but anyway, dominant race in a country, or dominant national characteristics. Bugger it, I'll use race. No, the dominant race being anti the other colour coming in. It tended to be one bunch of migrants of a non-Anglo-Saxon ethnicity being angry about the next wave of migrants of non-Anglo-Saxon ethnicity.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, and in Australia, it's been in waves, hasn't it? So in Australia, there was some animosity towards £10 POMs, and then there was more animosity towards British migrants when some of those British migrants, shock horror, turned out being black. And my God, they're black and they're English. How did that happen? And then of course, it all switched towards resistance to Greeks and Southern Europeans.
Yeah, I experienced a lot of this when I was a kid at school, because my best mates were the Greeks, the Lebanese, these, not I had plenty of Anglo mates as well, but I had lots of friends who were Greek, Lebanese, Sri Lankan, and there was very distinct racism from the other Anglos, not all of them again, because my friends weren't racist towards my Italian and my Aussie mates. They were also friends of my Italian, Greek, and Lebanese mates, and Sri Lankan. But there's definitely an undercore of racism. But that was broken down by the school system, and I find this something which one reason I'm a critic of private schools and the extent to which we've broken up the school system is that you now get different ethnic groups and different religious groups going to different schools. Or back when I was going to school, it was just a case of either the Catholic schools or the public schools, and public schools in Australia means publicly paid schools, not public as it meant in the UK.
Yeah.
And in my school, at least, what the teachers would do is they would sit together, the leaders of particular factions inside the class, and 90% of the time they'd become mates. And you get a breakdown in this level of outright racism, and that was a way of overcoming that initial reaction of one nationality to another, which was marvelous. But as we've now had education fragment in the way that it's happened in the last 20 years, all these private education systems, and people can choose to go to a Muslim school or a Catholic school or a Protestant school or a Montessori school, et cetera, you don't get that mixing anymore, and that the racism that starts off at school doesn't get broken down by school.
So it's partially that racism thing, but as you say, very often it's the migrants themselves who are complaining about the next wave of migrants, and that's because they see them as taking the jobs away that they came to take over. And often it's the unskilled, the low-skilled workers in deprived parts of the countries that move there because the housing is cheaper very often, and they're worried that someone's going to come and take their job and push wages down even further. And as you say, in good times, that's not a problem because there's more than enough jobs. The problem is the migration and the waves of the economy, isn't it?
And the factors behind it as well. I mean, if you think about migration back in, I was born in Australia in 1953, so I was at school by 57, 58, and across that period of time, the main wave of migration that was coming out were people who were refugees from what was left of Europe after the Second World War. Of course, that mainly occurred 45 to 60. But that was the pressure. So you had countries like Australia that were much lower population than now, like a population of about 8 million rather than 25 million, wanting to populate, wanting a workforce and bringing them over for those reasons. And there was a positive attitude in all the same sense to the extra people turning up because you with the booming economies we had between 45 and 73, then there was always the boom pressure that meant you wanted new workers coming in, and the old workers weren't worried about them losing their jobs because the unemployment was so low. People might not believe this, but back in 1973, the unemployment rate in Australia was 1.5%.
Wow. Yeah. So we think it's low, and we're at the point of full employment now, and nowhere near that. But look, the arguments.
5 and 6.
Yeah, exactly. Where do we draw the line then on migration? Because the arguments for migration, they're compelling, but they're also short term, aren't they? So they boost the working age population. But I mean, that would mean if you're going to keep on boosting the working age population, you've got to, because as migrants get older, you need to take more younger migrants to replace them. So that's a vicious cycle. They contribute more in taxes than they receive in benefits, is often in other words, they're net contributors to the economy. But you'd hope everyone is, non-migrants as well. We'd hope we'd all be contributing, as much as we're receiving anyway, certainly. So while we're of working age.
Hey, watch out, you're getting into you're falling into the line of funds.
No. Okay, no, it's what I was going to say was while we're of working age, we need to counter the people who can't work and the people who are old. But
I'll give you that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then better, and then they're better educated than the population as a whole. But I mean, that's because often they're younger than the population as a whole, and younger people tend to be better educated. So that all sounds great. But if you follow all of that logic, then you'd say, well, yes, we need to keep on having more and more migrants. Where do you draw the line?
The issue, but then you start writing little issues of population growth, the population pressure on the planet, and what's actually driving migration these days. And a large part of this now is getting caught up in the climate catastrophe we're approaching, because a lot of the migrants have been driven up by two factors. One is climate breakdown in places like Syria, which led to a lot of the immigration from Syria and Africa as well. And the second is the West's stupid interventions in the Middle East, which have actually caused so many people to want to leave because they're being shot at by both sides. It's been bad politics at one extreme, but also the impact on the climate. That's really what's driving the migration from those countries now. So it's no longer a case of them being driven away or leaving a devastated area after a war. They're being driven away by wars that often the West has created and by climate damage that we've also done far more to create than those countries have done. And then what you get is people turning up in economies which are now stagnant because of the last 30 or 40 years of financialization have destroyed the productivity of the economy. And so that angst is extreme. And I don't like the fact that that's why people are leaving. I can understand people leaving Europe to get away from the impact of the Second World War, and I know some people who do that for emotional rather than financial reasons. But when it's being driven around by climate breakdown or by the West's stupid interventions in the Middle East, then I'd rather stop the climate breakdown and the stupid interventions than say let's solve it by letting migration take place.
I mean, Syria obviously is a significant part of the picture currently. So this is World Bank data, 2017. So last year, 1.2 million people from Syria. That's in 1 year from one country. Net migration. Shocking, isn't it? Because it's not that big a country really. But also India and Bangladesh, net migration loss of 5 million people. China lost 1.6 million. So it's not just the Middle East. 1 million people from Pakistan. Obviously, the biggest move is to OECD countries. They've got a net gain of 13.2 million people last year. The European Union, it was 4.3 million, 4.5 million net gain for the United States. So you can see why Donald Trump is getting on his high horse. And these are, of course, official stats. So there'll be a lot of people who are not counted, which could make places like Syria far worse, of course.
That's extreme. I mean, then you look at it, what's causing migration now is not the aftermath of a crisis and the places you're migrating to are booming economies because, back to my favorite topic, the debt that caused the Great Depression was wiped out by the wars pretty much. So you had booming economies and plenty of credit demand and money turning over easily. You've now got them being driven away by climate change and by this huge disparity of incomes between the West and the Third World, even after the rise of China. And the reason that the economy is stagnant where they're going to is because of bad economic management that let the financial sector get out of control. So it's just the angst is on both sides, and that's where I see the level of passion and rise of xenophobia in Europe these days. It's a real worry, and how do you solve it? Because it's not being at the one end, it's not being solved with local planning. So the countries that they're going to, the question is, how many do you let in and how do you define who comes in? But even after you've let them in, planning is normally awful. So they do go to areas where they establish ghettos. There's not enough local services. They're not able to speak English. There's, obviously not enough services available to help them do that. We hear stories about them living in tent or a room. They run in a cash-in-hand economy sometimes, but there again, so do local people in those areas. And it's a failure of the system that some migrants, first of all, can take advantage of the system, but just as local people do, but also that the systems are not there to look after them and help them integrate and become part of society as well. Because it's called the degradation process. It's just a bad planning issue. Well, it's also, if we actually confront what we're doing to the planet, then we know that we've got to seriously reduce the human pressure on the planet, and that comes down to population as well as energy use and so on. And we've never addressed that either. So it's just a series of a cascade of mismanagements that are leading to people having to leave on a grand scale. And I think we've only seen the very beginning of it. If we start seeing serious climate breakdown, many people are forced to move. Wars started occurring because of climate breakdown, and that's certainly one of the arguments behind where the Syria conflict began, and some of the conflicts in Africa as well. And then people moving to get away from that, the waves of migration are going to overwhelm any of the systems the West has in position.
So how do we solve that? I mean, in the short term and the long term, obviously it's a bigger picture of, it's easy to say we just need to stop climate change. But even now with those migration levels that we've seen, 1 million people a year from Syria, which is astonishing.
It's too much. It is, and that's leading to breakdown both it's breakdown in the source country and breakdown of the destination country as well. And I can understand, to some extent, the alt-right's argument that, this is breaking down our cultures as well. It doesn't have to, but it's very hard to maintain a culture when you have such a wave of people coming in who aren't part of that culture. And if you don't have the boom going on, which Australia had at that stage, the extent to which migrants to Australia were assimilated into the good sides of Australian culture and brought their good sides as well in the 40s and 50s and 60s were extraordinary. And I would hate to imagine Australia without the migration that it received in those days. It'd be a totally boring Anglo-Saxon country where the most interesting thing you could eat was a meat pie. And you're going to see, The Sound of Music as your best musical. It dramatically improved the country to have that level of migration. But that was back when population levels were about half what they are now on the planet, when we hadn't broken the ecological constraints of the planet completely, as we did pretty much starting from 1975 on. So this is with a huge symptom, I think, of we're losing control of the biosphere.
And the answers always seem to be very short term, don't they? So Theresa May, because the UK now, Theresa May, who is of course the architect of the hostile environment policy, which anybody who's handled the immigration process in the UK will know, it doesn't just affect people from the West Indies, but it's been a shocking approach to migration in the UK. It's very difficult to move here if you're outside the EU. There's lots of
to be a tourist there as well, as I found out the hard way, trying to get my partner to come and join me to see Wimbledon.
Yeah, well, there we are. No, we just don't want you. Yeah, it's hostile environment. What a word to say to entice people. But her answer is, because Britain's got to find a solution, of course, after post Brexit, about how they handle migration, because there's going to be no freedom of movement from Europe. So how do you determine who's allowed to come and work in this country? And Theresa May has suggested, well, only migrants who have jobs of £30,000 or more per year, which is actually above the average wage. So that excludes people, hospital workers that there's a shortage of. It excludes qualified young people, because they, of course, when they leave university, their average starting salary is well below the average wage. So not a lot of thought gone into that. But clearly, how do you set the bar? Do you just go for do you say, well, okay, we're only going to take the best? But you also need unskilled labour. Where do they come from? How do you set criteria to allow people into your country?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to look at the extent to which your country can cope with the infrastructure demands that new people make on it, because this is one issue which a lot of my colleagues in Australia have focused on. They talk about capital widening versus capital deepening. And if you have a large migration coming in, something of the order of 1% of your population per year, then if you're going to actually properly support them, you've got to build roads, you've got to build schools, you've got to build hospitals and so on, which is effectively replicating what you've currently got for the increase in population. If you have, but if you want to grow in the genuine sense of having a higher standard of living per person, then you want to be capital deepening. You want to be adding better schools, better roads, better technology, better innovation, and your infrastructure direction is quite different. There's a tipping point where your infrastructure is all into expanding your capacity at the current level of technology versus improving your technology and getting a higher per capita income. And I think certainly when you look at a level of immigration exceeding 1% of your existing population, then I think you're in trouble on that front. And the country has a legitimate right to say, no, we want it to be lower than that. But then, of course, the situation of where the people are turning up is not because they're migrants in the sense of looking for a job in a different country. It's because they're refugees from the breakdown of their own societies where we've contributed to that breakdown. And then you get caught with,
but it's not
should be making decisions on humanitarian grounds.
Yeah, well, I mean,
which we won't do these days.
No, we won't. But it's not just that, is it? Because I mean, the nice argument, the ideal solution we'd all like to see is that every country in the world's living standard improved to such an extent that everyone would say, well, we're quite happy here. Thanks very much. We don't see the need to move. And so you look at the emerging middle class in India and China and think, well, okay, they wouldn't be migrating a lot, but it seems the wealthier their countries become, I guess it's because people's aspirations rise. As I said, 1.6 million people a year from China, between India and Bangladesh, 5 million. I think it's about 3 million from India. So there's a country that's improving its position, but also increasing its net migration. And I guess that's aspirational. These people want to go and live in other parts of the world.
Yeah, but I think in that's like China and India's probably got some serious climate problems coming its way. China's addressing its serious climate problems, I think, better than virtually any other country on the planet. So you won't necessarily see climate refugees coming from them, but you are going to be seeing it from Africa and from the Middle East. And in that scale, you simply can't say, no, you've got to go back there and die in the 40-degree temperatures rather than coming to us. It's testing what is the definition of our humanity. And that's one of the great problems that we're facing here, that the economic and ecological problems we're in are undermining our own humanity.
All right, final word on Brexit, seeming as that is very much the flavour of the news environment in the UK at the moment. So the whole idea of the free movement rule for the EU was, it was all about addressing labour imbalances, wasn't it? So if a coal mine closes in Yorkshire and there's work in Spain, why not go there? Particularly if it's more affordable for you to move to a region in Europe than it would be to, for example, try and find accommodation and pay for it in the south of England, which for someone from a mining community in Yorkshire would just be ridiculous. That was the whole principle behind free movement within the EU. What's wrong with that? We're talking about a constrained section of the world.
Well, free movement is actually undermining population centres because people are doing the internal migration from areas where the economy is contracting to where it's expanding. And that's meaning that where it's contracting, it contracts faster. I gave a few talks in Croatia last year.
So like the net migration from Greece would be a great example of that.
Yeah, and particularly Croatia, though, because Croatia is nowhere near as damaged as Greece has been. Of course, the European Union hasn't quite got its mitts on it yet. But I went from Zagreb down to a place called Split, and on the drive through, my hosts were casually saying, "Oh, this town has got no more people living in it now." And you're just going through quite a lovely-looking little village, and literally there's nobody living there. It's empty. And the reason is because they've all gone for jobs that they can now get by going to Berlin and Frankfurt and whatever else. And what you're getting is depopulation. And there's one of the few pieces of economic theory that I have a lot of time for is by a guy called Hotelling. And he argued that if you imagine a beach and you had a uniform distribution of people on the beach going swimming, and you had an ice cream stall.
We've covered this one.
Where's the best place for the ice cream stall? It's right in the middle of the beach.
Yeah.
Okay. If you then have two ice cream stalls, what's the best location for the swimmers on the beach? It's to have one at the 1/3 mark and one at the 2/3 mark. However, if the one at the 1/3 mark moves next to the one at the 2/3 mark, he gets 2/3 of the market in terms of people taking the shortest route to get to the ice cream. So what actually happens is they all cluster at the 50% mark. And that therefore means you simply can't rely upon market mechanisms to choose the best outcome. You've got to say, no, you're going to be at the 1/3 mark and you're going to be at the 2/3 mark. And this, again, is a similar sort of thing for migration. You can't just rely upon the market to determine it. Now, when you have something like open access, open movement, as you have in the European Union, you're letting the market determine it. What happens? The areas which are poor get depopulated. And that's the opposite of what the European Union was supposed to achieve.
This is a very fundamental economic principle, though, isn't it? The whole, this whole accumulation of capital. It's always going to gather in the one place.
Yeah, so that's why, in that sense, I think the whole idea of free movement was a mistake. Like a lot of the European Union is based on a very simplistic notion of the economy, leaving out spatial issues. And when you take the spatial issues into account, what is a good idea when there's no such thing as space is a stupid idea when we live on a planet. And that's so for the free movement thing is actually undermines the viability of the economy when the whole idea of the theory is going to improve the viability of the economy. So in that sense, free movement is a farce.
So the extreme then, forget about the EU, look at it from the planet. The extreme is to say, well, we'll have no migration. We will just have to try and tackle why does people want to move in the first place? Which is trying to
that is the other extreme of the cure. I'd rather have a bit of a balance on that front and have a little bit of movement around, of course.
Yeah, well,
but
someone
idea that
who's
free
moved
movement is a superior ideological position, a sort of a left position is better. I think that's wrong.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know what the happy medium is, but I fear that we're not going to reach it, and we will just have more unrest as we're seeing around the world. And
that, unfortunately, I think is the case.
All right. Okay. Good to talk, Steve. Catch you again very soon.
Okay, mate. Bye.
Yeah, there we are. That's a very uplifting talk, isn't it, for Christmas week? Goodwill to all men, unless they're foreign. Look, next time, productivity. Can we increase productivity simply by growing the economy? In short, do we work harder when we are busier? In which case, pump priming the economy should improve productivity. A double whammy. We'll look at that theory next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll be back then too. See you soon.